So what I will be talking about today, and I'm going to apologize to about 5 people in the room who've heard this before, but I want to talk a little bit about the history of why microplastics kind of landed in Puget Sound. And so I'll be talking about microplastics in the Puget Sound from 2008 to present. As you can see on this picture here, in my opening slide, this is where I get to work. It's a beautiful place to work. This is Commencement Bay, and at the end of the bay, if you go straight to the center of the picture, is the Center for Urban Waters. It's a wonderful, beautiful location right on the Thea Foss waterway off of Commencement Bay. And you can see the red building is right in the smack dab in the middle of an industrial area on the Thea Foss. And there is a dock that we just basically get off on. And a friend of mine was walking across the 11th Street Bridge in Tacoma at 7 o'clock in the morning, and guess what she saw? She saw me sampling at 7 o'clock in the morning. So if you look at the bottom of the picture, you actually see us out sampling, which is typically when we go out, is early in the morning when the sea state is quite calm. And I love it in the morning, so it's perfect. Just like an 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday, excellent plastic summit. So today I'm going to talk about plastics and the plastic problem. I'm basically going to repeat what Peter Ross has talked about, so I'll go through that pretty quickly. And then we'll talk about the development of field and laboratory methods. And then finally, I want to talk about the water survey results. So most people ask me, what are some of the results of your water surveys? And so this summer, I had a couple of undergraduates go through all the data, and we're going to be presenting just a little snippet of those results today. And then if there's a little bit of time left, I want to talk to you about a new beginning. So I'd like to end my talk, if we have time, about a new beginning of monitoring beaches throughout the Puget Sound, and actually the Salish Sea and the west coast of Vancouver Island. So in 2008, the University of Washington Tacoma hosted the first international research workshop on what we know and what we don't know about microplastic marine debris. And there were many different objectives. First, is it a problem? Okay, we figured out yes. We basically focused on the occurrences and impacts of organisms, impacts of exposure, and effects on biogeochemical cycling. And what came out of the meeting, and I think this is actually kind of continued today, in fact, I know this is to be true, is we needed to standardize field methods and how to sample on the water and also on the shorelines. Another thing that needed to be standardized were laboratory methods for assessing the amount of plastics. How many folks have done that research? Counting and picking and hundreds and thousands of fibers. It's a lot of work, and so we were looking for ways in which we can kind of streamline some of those processes. But as Peter had pointed out, Peter number one, the first speaker, pointed out that the biggest thing that came out was this definition of what microplastics were. And throughout the literature, less than 5 millimeters of the largest axis on any fragment of plastic would be considered microplastic. So as was pointed out, or plastics are defined as any solid material that's primarily composed of polymers. You've got your primary plastics. We call these nurdles pre-production plastic pellets. They were manufactured to be that size. And then secondary plastics, the ones that have broken down from larger primary plastics, as we see here. Okay. And so some size classifications have come out and are used differently in different labs also, but to standardize some of the beach plastic monitoring and the water monitoring, we propose the classification types as mega. Anything that, when I'm teaching grade school students, anything that's a little bit bigger than the palm of your hand, that works. That's going to be a megaplastic. Microplastic is going to be anything, macroplastics, anything between the palm of your hand and the thickness of a pencil. Micro is going to be anything from about the thickness of a skinny pencil and the width of a pin. And that's the focus of my work. And then I do like to add the idea of a nanoplastic, which is anything that's less than, 330 microns, which is basically the mesh of the net that we use to do the sampling. So after that first conference, first meeting, basically we were asked at the Center for Urban Waters to figure out how much plastic's in the ocean. It's a lot of work. Yeah, I was exhausted just thinking about it. But really what they were asking about is there a way in which you can come up with a streamlined method of field sampling and also laboratory analyses that can get a quick assessment and idea of how much plastic was in the ocean, because no one really knew. People talked about it. There's been previous research counting and different methods, but really there wasn't a real and temporal, a real understanding of the amount of plastics in the ocean. And so the cool thing, that was 2008. It's 2017. There's a lot of literature out there, and we know a lot, so much. There's so much dedication to understanding the plastic pollution problem that we've really kind of caught up. So our task was to quantify certain types. We were focusing on polyethylene, polypropylene, polyvinyl chloride, and then we had to add a fourth one, polystyrene, because we see that everywhere. It's very prolific. In specific locations, we were looking on beach sampling methods. We were looking at water sampling methods, both at the surface and within the water column, and also looking at sediments within those locations within the ocean. And so what you see here, and I think this screen's a little bit better, you can actually see a sample with lots of little dots in here. Those white dots were basically discovered to be all plastic. The black dots, and this sample actually came from the East Coast. Can we guess what those black dots are? Coal, yeah. And I was like, what is all this black stuff? Because we're here in the Pacific Northwest. We use hydroelectric power, coal in our water. That's really weird. But that's kind of normal on the East Coast. So there was a lot of coal, and so I learned that. So that was kind of fun. A few years later, or maybe not so fun, a few years later, we hosted the second research workshop on microplastics debris at the Center for Urban Waters. It was the first time I met Peter, which is great to meet him. And that was when we opened our brand new, beautiful building. And the focus of that was assessing risks and, again, trying to standardize practice. And as you continue to read the literature, everybody still has their own way of looking at different ways in which you can sample, in which you can process plastics in the lab. So we're still working on that, but we're continuing that discussion. So let's focus in on what we decided to do. So when I first, I'm the field gal. You know, I did all the field work. I'd love to be out in the field. I'm on boats all the time. And so basically I went into my field room, and I call it shopping. I pulled out a plankton net, and I threw it in the water, and I told the captain to go fast so he can drag this plankton net right on the surface, right? And so it whipped out and hit the front of the boat. It's like, okay, slow down. So he went slower, and the plankton net sunk. And I'm like, there's got to be a better way. So I Googled, actually I searched on NOAA's site, and I found some plans for this net. This is called a manta net. This is a modified manta net that samples on the upper 0.2 meters of the surface. This is all of this slimy stuff is a huge plankton bloom up in Glacier Bay. We tow this plankton net this manta net I should say, behind a boat 2 to 4 knots or so for about 5 to 15 minutes. It's the longest 15 minutes of your day, okay? We're drinking lots of coffee. And then in the field, we typically will sieve it right in the field, and then we'll bring it to the lab on ice. This is actually a sample from Clayoquot Sound up off west coast of Vancouver Island, and you can see there's lots of slimy stuff in there. We do the sieving right on the boat. And then this is actually from the East Coast, from Middle River, and you can actually see these nurdles and pre-protection plastic pellets. Can you guys see my cursor? I can't see what you're seeing. So you can't see the cursor? Oh, darn it. So if you see the white kind of flecks and the blue flecks, there's lots of plastic that we found in there. But one thing I wanted to show you, and I think this is really important, these are 4 samples that were taken at that second workshop. These are 4 samples that were collected on the same day in the same location. What does this show you? There's a lot of variability in the amount of solids that exist in a water sample if you sample it the same day or weeks later. So we're dealing not only with trying to understand how much plastic's in the system, but also understanding that there's a lot of different variability on the solids, which are hence a part of those plastics. Something to keep in mind. So we use a wet peroxide analysis. Basically, we oxidize all of the slimy natural organic material, and then we put it through a series of sieves, and then we pick, and we pick. Right, Jessica? And we pick. We pick it all out. And now we do some verbal or visual stuff. So these are 2 pennies, and I showed this talk in Canada a couple days ago, actually. And they're like, what are those copper things? You guys know they don't have pennies in Canada anymore? I thought that was kind of funny. But they remember those old ancient things. So here's a couple of pennies of the typical amounts of plastic that we get from the majority of our samples, okay? So how much water does that equate to? About a half a swimming pool of like a hotel-sized swimming pool. That's a lot of water that we're getting this much plastic out of, okay? Now, I'm not talking fibers. Fibers would typically go through those nets. These are the solid, we get some fibers, but these are the solid plastics, like the fragments, the nurdles, etc. Okay? So, this water survey results. It takes several hours to collect one sample. Okay, several hours to collect one sample. And so I couldn't do this without many volunteers from many groups throughout the Puget Sound region. So I have Tacoma Community College, Bellarmine Prep School, North Seattle Community College, the Seattle Aquarium, Jason Lee Middle School has helped us out, NOAA's Marine Debris Program, of course, the Sea Education Adventure Program, which is an outdoor education group that used to be pretty active here in the Puget Sound. Sound Experience, this tall ship, during one of their rotations for all of their education programs, actually collect samples and send them to our lab, in which we get to process. And they're pretty sneaky and slimy, but it's pretty cool. So they get quite an real extent of places in the Puget Sound. And then finally, of course, we have a newest partnership with the Department of Ecology looking at sediments that they've been collecting for several years. So this is just some of the areas in which we sample, all the way up towards north of the San Juan Islands, down all the way south to Olympia. You can see there's some freshwater samples here in the Puyallup River watershed. Also, if this would extend off of the edge of the screen here, we sample all up and down the west coast of Vancouver Island. So I wanted to show some of the yearly results. And what I have here is data from 2010. So during 2008 and 2009, we were developing the methods and making a lot of wonderful hypotheses changes, aka tons of really bad mistakes. And so about 2010, we finally figured out a really good way in which we can sample and process these environmental samples in the laboratory. And then we have through 2017. What is missing is 2016, kind of a dry year for sampling, but we're actually starting to increase our sampling numbers again here in 2017. So you can see the minimum, we get zeros. When I first starting for about 2 years, I used to report some of the results, and I'd say I've always found plastics in every single sample that I've ever collected. But some I see zeros, okay? Now, we don't have as fine of, we're not looking for the fibers per se. We're looking at things that are 330 microns, or the width of a pin, all the way through to the width of a pencil. So that makes a little bit of sense. The maximum, so the way I'm reporting here is a little bit different than was reported by the previous speakers. Notice here I'm reporting in the amount of microplastics mass divided by the dry mass, so the solid material. So again, because there's such a variability of the amount of dry mass that we have in our samples, I like to report in microplastics per dry mass. Now I do have the calculations per liter, Okay, and that makes more sense. We're not teasing through a lot of the material, so this is a little bit different. These values are a little bit different. So these are in parts per thousand, and you can see here we have maximums are about 55%, or I think it's about 58%, have plastics in their dry mass. Now what that means is there was a big chunk of plastic and a whole bunch of dry material, like maybe pieces of wood, etc. So those are kind of rare. So these maximums are just a couple of hits, and I'll show you the next slide on a box and whisker plant to show you how those values kind of change. But if we look here, the average over time for the amount of plastics in dry mass is less than 10%. Is less than 10%. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, it hasn't changed in many, many years, so that's kind of an interesting value. When I compare these values to the west coast of Vancouver Island, the average is 3%. So we need to do a little bit better. So I wanted to show also what we call, these are box and whisker plants. And here, again, this is going to be your microplastics mass per dry mass in parts per thousand. And each of these boxes here represents a series of data sets. And as the boxes get thicker, that just means I had an opportunity to collect more samples, okay? If the boxes are skinnier, that means there's not as many samples that were collected. And all of these points here, call them valid outliers, okay? So rarely in the hundreds of samples that we collected here in 2012, we had some big hits, okay? But notice that all of these box plots, they overlap. What does that mean? There really hasn't been a change in the amount of plastics in the Puget Sound over time, okay? Even though you see a little bit of change, statistically there isn't a ton of change. We don't see an increase in this short, very short time period. And we don't necessarily see a decrease. It's kind of stayed the same over time. Okay? So that is basically the lab and the field portion of the talk. And I just, of course, have to recognize our funders, NOAA's Marine Debris Program, and as well as GSAO, which is a partnership with NOAA and the University of Washington. So I always love to point out my research team because it's not me. I don't do anything. I just get to look good. I get to work with all these wonderful students. And this last group of students, these are freshmen. So I get to teach, I have the honor to teach a freshman class on plastic marine debris. And these guys come back. And this kid here, he's a biomed major. And so I can actually go through and tell you so many successes of the freshmen that I get to work with in this plastic marine debris class. How much time do I have? Oh, perfect. Okay, cool. That's excellent. So let's talk about a new beginning. So I just recently became a part of a research team, a team of women scientists that we received a grant for an NSERC. It's like the NSF of Canada. And so this science team is comprised of Audrey Dallimore and Leslie King from Royal Roads University. In the center there, we have Laura Lokes. She is one of the science directors at the Clackwit Biosphere Trust. And then on the left here, we have Cheryl Greengrove from the University of Washington, Tacoma. She's helping out some of the Ahosit, the First Nations students, on looking at plankton. And then on the right is me actually talking to a group of Ahosit students, First Nation students, right there in their village. You can only get there by boat. What a beautiful place to work. What a beautiful place to live. And if you look into the background, you see these wonderful islands. And if you look just beyond my shoulder, you'll see the boat that they use during their yearly canoe paddle to, Ocean Shores. They actually come to Washington State, and they get welcomed to Washington State. And you see a series of students just paying attention, super excited, super motivated about being involved in their environment. So here we have a picture of Xavier and David. They kept switching hats and sweatshirts trying to confuse us who they were. They were super funny. I was laughing the whole entire time. They were so cool. One of the elders is right behind that little bleached out area. And if you look kind of in the foreground, we're doing some research. We're monitoring plastics on their beach. They're from the Moktusis school. Their teacher is an implant from the University of Toronto, from Toronto area. So she came all the way over from the East Coast. 16 students and several elders were out taking tweezers and monitoring for beach plastics on the beach. It was so cool. We sampled 3 locations on their front beach, and then they're going to continue sampling on Front Beach, and they're going to enter a contest in which these students are going to be continually monitoring their beaches and reporting their results. Got it. So here is, if you look at the upper left-hand area and look along the beach, I know you have to do a little squinting, but you see little dots? They were still working when we left. We came all around the island. We started heading back to Tofino, and they're still working on the beach. They were so cool. In the middle there, we've got Lennox. He needed to dig a hole, right? If you've ever taught and you've always got someone that's really distracted and you ask a question, they answer the question. He was so present mentally. He dug himself a hole, and he was still there. It was really kind of cool. Here, and this is something that Peter Ross had talked about, is the surf riders, and they are actually doing a major beach cleanup where they'll be reporting their data to the Canadian Beach Cleanup Association. So that's pretty super, and so we partnered up with them. And here's Diamond and Juniper, excuse me. And these are going to be you're going to see these women. You're going to see them talking about plastics in the future. They're super awesome. After that, we worked with the local community school called the Wickeninish Community School in Tofino. And so these were about half and half First Nations and everybody who lives in Tofino is kind of an immigrant. I would say, like, they basically came to Tofino to go surfing, essentially, is what that community's kind of about. Their teacher, Melanie Morris, and 20 students and I, when we went out on the beach, there was a gal from the Rain Coast Education Society who was out there with us. And this guy in the middle, this is Jeffrey. Jeffrey was done sampling. So he asked me, he said, Julie, can I start collecting cigarette butts in the beach and collect some data and report it back to you? And I said, yes, you can. I think that's so cool. So he was just continuing, just kind of cleaning up the beach and collecting data. So here we have students. Last slide, perfect. Here we have some students that are doing some work here on the beach. And they were fighting over these tweezers. Isn't this cool? They were fighting over these tweezers just to collect data and asking, can we get more sand? I'm like, no, just in your quadrat. Moving on. So why is this really important? Because we're going to map this network of this beach cleaning off the west coast of Vancouver Island throughout the Puget Sound. So watch out. There's going to be a bunch of purple bins that are going to be coming around to the schools nearest you. So we're going to start collecting and monitoring beach plastic debris. That's all I have. Thank you so much. Do I have any time? Oh, cool. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, I've got about... not according to mine, right? No, I think we need to get on. Yeah. Nope, actually, I've used up all my time. Sorry about that, guys. Great. I could answer one question if you guys anybody have a question. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. So sorry.
Hi, thank you. I just wonder if there's any data at all available comparing coastal communities who've passed plastic ordinances or regulations versus those that haven't, and if there's any significant findings that can be used in communities trying to do that.
Yeah, I think we're trying to do that now. You know, it's definitely something that we're trying to do right now. And when I was there on the West Coast, I was just there. Yes, I just got back last night. So they're doing wonderful stuff there, and they're really working with policy folks in their parks and stuff with this cleanup, and so they're collecting that data. I just haven't seen a report out of it yet. And there's been not only the Canadian beach cleanups, but of course the world beach cleanups that people are probably aware of.